All right, everyone, get ready, because today we are going deep on communism.
Ooh, communism.
You know, the one that sparked revolutions, shaped global politics, and still gets people fired up today.
What's wild to me is how often we use the word communism, but we don't really get what it
Right,
means.
like we say democracy, but there's so many different types.
Exactly, and that's where this deep dive comes in.
Yeah, we've got excerpts from this communism.pdf. It seems like a pretty legit academic overview.
Yeah.
And we're going to break it all down and figure out what communism's really all about.
Yeah, so we want you to understand not just what it is, but why and how. Like its history, its different forms, its wins, its losses, the whole thing.
Okay, let's unpack this. So how does communism.pdf define communism?
Okay, so it describes communism as like a socioeconomic order that's all about common ownership of the means of production.
Okay.
So think factories, land tools, anything used to make goods and services.
Okay.
The end goal, a classless, stateless society where things are shared based on need, not profit.
That sounds pretty idealistic.
Hmm.
You know, everyone working together, no more rich and poor.
Yeah.
But can we actually achieve that? And where did this idea even come from?
Well, the word communism itself actually comes from the Latin communis, which means common plus that isme at the end, so a state of being.
Nice.
So it literally means a state of being of or for the community.
So it's all about everyone, not just me.
Yeah, in theory, but communism.pdf points out that this super broad definition has led to so many different versions of communism throughout history. And like you said about its origins, this whole idea of shared stuff actually goes way back, like even before Marx and Engels.
Really? I always thought they, invented communism.
It's a common misconception.
Right.
You can find hints of communist thought back in ancient Greece and Rome.
Wow.
Persia with the Mazdak movement,
Okay.
and even in medieval Christian monasteries.
Okay. He's popping up.
Exactly. And there's a group called the Hutterites. They were like a religious sect that lived communally and shared everything based on what the Bible said.
Wow.
Like imagine a pre-industrial kibbutz, but hundreds of years ago.
That's so cool. I had no idea. So were all these early examples just ideas? Or did people actually try to live like this?
Well, there are some really cool attempts. Remember Thomas More's Utopia from the 1500s?
Yeah.
It was all about a society based on common ownership. It basically foreshadowed modern socialist thought.
Oh, so we see these early ideas, but when did communism become an actual movement?
In the 1600s, we see groups like the Diggers in England pop up.
Diggers.
Yeah, they wanted to abolish private land ownership. And around that time, Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Mobley were super critical of private property.
Makes sense.
They thought it caused inequality and messed up society.
So the Enlightenment had a big impact. I mean, it was a time of huge change, like the French Revolution.
Right. And communism.pdf says that after the French Revolution, communism really became like a solid political thing. Thinkers like Babeuf and Maréchal, they saw the chaos and started to really articulate these early communist ideas.
So they were the real pioneers.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then in the 1800s, people actually tried to make these ideas happen.
Okay.
You know, on a smaller scale, of course. These utopian socialist communities like Robert Owen's New Harmony in Indiana popped up.
Interesting.
It was a wild time of social experiments. People were trying to create little utopias based on sharing and cooperation.
But those didn't really last, did they?
Most of them didn't. A lot of infighting and pressure from the outside world, but they were important because they showed that people were actually trying to make a more just and fair society.
Right. And then, of course, we can't forget the big names, Marx and Engels,
Right.
their Communist Manifesto. That came out in 1848. It really shook things up, right?
Absolutely. It wasn't just some theory book. It was a call to action. It got people excited about revolution and gave communist movements all over the world a way to organize and get things done.
So it went from just thinking about it to actually doing something. And then we have the October Revolution in Russia in 1917.
Right.
Things get really complicated here.
Yeah, this is where theory meets reality.
Okay.
Marx thought that socialist revolutions would happen in advanced capitalist countries, but Russia was mostly farms
Yeah.
and didn't have that many industrial workers. So this whole thing caused huge debates for Marxists.
So was Marx wrong? Or was Russia like a weird exception?
People are still arguing about that today.
Wow.
But the Bolsheviks were successful because they understood what the Russian people wanted and needed.
Like what?
Slogans like peace, bread, and land, they really hit home with people who were tired of war and wanted change.
So the right message at the right time. But didn't the Bolsheviks also do some good stuff?
Yeah, for sure. They started universal education and healthcare,
Really?
and they fought for equal rights for women,
Wow.
which was pretty radical back then.
Yeah. But then there's that whole thing about them dissolving the Constituent Assembly.
Oh, yeah.
Communism.pdf mentions it, but it doesn't really go into detail.
Yeah, it's because it's super complicated and controversial.
Huh?
The Bolsheviks said it had to be done to keep the revolution going and stop people from fighting against it.
I see.
But critics saw it as them just wanting all the power and the start of a dictatorship.
So even at the beginning of communist rule, we see this clash between good intentions and the reality of power,
Exactly. And this gets even worse when we get to Stalin and the Soviet Union.
which is a whole other story that we will get into in part 2 of this deep dive. So last time we were talking about the Bolsheviks taking over in Russia and things getting, well, pretty messy. Communism.pdf talks about the time of Stalin and the Soviet Union, and it sounds like things got even more crazy.
Yeah, it was a time of huge change, like some good, some bad. Under Stalin, Russia industrialized super fast, and he collectivized agriculture, basically rebuilt the whole country after World War II.
So there were some good things that happened, right? But communism.pdf also mentioned this terrible famine in 1946 and 1947. How does that fit in?
Well, forcing collectivization and then some bad droughts led to crops failing and not enough food, and millions of people died. It's just really sad. Like, even when you try to do something good, it can have awful consequences, especially if you force it on everyone.
Yeah, and then you have the political crackdowns and that horrible gulag system. Was all that really necessary to make these communist goals happen?
That's the big question, isn't it? Stalin said that they had to do it to get rid of enemies and keep control, but lots of historians say it was just a brutal dictatorship that crushed freedom and human rights, all because of this ideology.
So it's a mixed bag for sure. Russia modernized super fast, but it cost a lot of human suffering.
Exactly. And all this was going on while things were getting worse and worse with the West, which led to the Cold War starting in 1947. Everyone was scared. The world had these two superpowers fighting over ideology and military power.
Yeah. And meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, another communist power was growing. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War and started the People's Republic of China in 1949.
And right away, China was pulled into the Korean War, fighting against the UN and the US. It showed just how big the Cold War had become. This wasn't just about Europe anymore. It was this global fight between communism and capitalism.
It's crazy how Stalin and Mao are like these huge figures in the history of communism. They did some amazing things, but also some terrible things. It's hard to understand how those two sides can exist in the same people.
Yeah, it's a challenge for anyone trying to understand communism. On the one hand, they led their countries through insane social and economic change. They brought industry, education, healthcare to so many people. Their governments were also responsible for so much suffering, political repression, and millions of deaths. It shows that even the best ideas can get twisted when people get power.
And communism.pdf says that this wasn't just happening in Russia and China. After World War II, lots of countries in Eastern Europe, with help from the Soviet Union, became Marxist-Leninists. They formed this communist bloc.
But even within that bloc, there were differences. Yugoslavia with Tito and Albania with Hoxha. They did their own thing. They didn't follow the Soviet model exactly. They showed that there wasn't just one way to build a communist society.
So we've covered a lot of history, but communism.pdf also digs into the theory behind communism. Can we break down some of the main ideas of Marxist thought?
Of course. One big idea is class struggle. Marx said that history is all about conflict between different social classes who want different things. Like in capitalism, you have the bourgeoisie, the people who own everything,
Right.
and the proletariat, the workers who have to sell their labor.
So it's all about power and exploitation in the capitalist system. But wouldn't people who like capitalism say that it actually makes things better for everyone?
Yeah, that's a main argument for capitalism, and it's true that capitalism has made some people very wealthy. But Marx thought that this wealth comes from exploiting workers. He thought capitalism was unstable and would eventually destroy itself.
Okay, that makes sense. What about this idea of historical materialism? It seems kind of complicated.
Yeah, basically historical materialism says that economics is the driving force behind history. Like how we produce and share things determines our social relationships, our governments, even our culture and ideas.
Whoa. I need a minute to think about that one. Can someone grab me a coffee?
Yeah.
Okay. So if economics is the driving force, what does that mean for the future? Is capitalism doomed, like Marx said?
That's still a huge debate, but Marx thought that capitalism would be overthrown by a socialist revolution led by the working class,
Yeah.
and that would lead to a classless communist society.
But that hasn't really happened, has it? We've had revolutions, but capitalism is still here.
That's true. Capitalism has adapted really well. But some people say that the problems that Marx pointed out are still here. Inequality, social unrest, and young people being interested in socialist ideas.
So maybe Marx wasn't wrong just about the timing.
Maybe. But it's important to remember that Marx's ideas are just that, ideas. They help us understand history and society, but they don't predict the future.
Communism.pdf also talks about the difference between socialization and nationalization. I always thought those were the same thing.
Yeah, lots of people think that socialization, which is what lots of Marxists want, is about everyone owning and controlling the means of production. It's about giving workers and communities control over their own economies, not just giving it all to the government.
So it's more than just the government taking over businesses. It's about real economic democracy.
Exactly. Nationalization, which is what happened in a lot of communist countries, can actually be a type of state capitalism,
Right.
where the government is the capitalist.
That's an important difference. And then you have this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that time between capitalism and communism. How did Marx think that would work?
Well, this is where it gets even more complicated. Marx saw it as a temporary thing needed to get rid of the old government and create a more democratic system. He didn't give a ton of details, so it's open to interpretation.
So is that where things went wrong? Did Lenin and Stalin just use this idea to justify being dictators?
That's a big part of the debate. Lenin said that Russia needed a strong central party to lead the revolution and protect it. And Stalin, of course, took that to an extreme. He built a totalitarian state that crushed anyone who disagreed with him.
So even within Marxist thought, there are these big disagreements about how to get to communism, what it would actually look like.
Yeah.
And communism.pdf talks about all these different versions like Leninism, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's like a family tree with branches growing in all different directions. But it's important to remember that these different versions often come from specific historical contexts and interpretations of Marx's ideas.
Like different ways of responding to the same problems.
Exactly. Leninism focused on the role of a vanguard party leading the revolution, while Stalinism was all about authoritarianism and control.
And then there's Trotskyism from Leon Trotsky, who was a major part of the Russian Revolution, but then became a big critic of Stalin.
Right, Trotsky believed in permanent revolution. He thought socialism couldn't survive in just one place. It had to spread everywhere. He thought Stalinism was a betrayal of the revolution, a messed up version of Marx's vision.
So he wanted a more global and democratic kind of socialism.
Yeah, and his ideas were popular with some people, but were ultimately shut down in the Soviet Union.
Communism.apdf also mentions Euro-communism, which sounds less about revolution and more about democracy.
Yeah, that was a big deal, especially during the Cold War. Euro-communism started in Western Europe and focused on a peaceful transition to socialism through democracy. They didn't like the Soviet model and were all about elections and freedom.
So they were trying to find a balance between revolution and reform.
Exactly. They wanted to find a way to make socialism work with democratic values and systems.
And then there are the more libertarian forms of communism, like libertarian Marxism and council communism. What makes those different?
Those focus on workers freeing themselves and direct democracy. They don't trust the government or vanguard parties and want a more decentralized and participatory socialism.
So like in council communism, workers would run the factories and make decisions together.
Exactly. They imagine a society where power is in local councils or workers' assemblies, not in some central government.
It sounds like those libertarian forms of communism are really big on individual freedom.
Oh, yeah. They think the goal of communism isn't just economic equality, but also freedom from all kinds of oppression and hierarchy. They challenge the idea that you need a strong state to make a communist society.
Wow, this is a lot to think about. It seems like communism isn't just one big idea. It's more like a whole bunch of ideas and movements, all trying to figure out how to make a more just and fair society. It's really amazing how one idea can turn into so many different things. We started with ancient communes, then we went to Marxist revolutions, and from there to dictatorships and democratic socialist movements. Communism is like a living thing that's changing all the time.
And it's still changing. Communism.pdf talks about what's happening today. You know how communism declined after the Soviet Union fell, but there are still communist countries like China, Cuba, North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam.
It's interesting how each of those countries has kind of adapted communism to their own culture and history.
Yeah, like China. They've done a lot of economic reforms, mixing in some capitalism with their socialist system.
Oh, wow.
It's this hybrid thing that has made their economy grow like crazy. But it also raises some questions about inequality and whether it's really still communism.
So is China still communist?
Uh-huh.
Or is it something totally different?
People are arguing about that right now. Some say that China isn't really communist anymore, just in name only. But others think it's like a new kind of socialism that's changing with the times.
And the other communist countries, are they all copying China?
Not really. Cuba, for example, is still pretty traditional socialist, but they've made a few small changes to their economy. North Korea is like a whole other thing. They're
Yeah.
super isolated and authoritarian with their own strange version of communism.
It sounds like the future of communism is really uncertain. Communism.pdf mentions all the debates and criticisms about communism, whether it can really work as an economic system and what its history tells us.
There are good arguments on both sides. Critics say that communism has failed to do what it promised, like economic equality, and that it often leads to dictatorships and human rights abuses.
So couldn't you say that those failures happened because of how communism was put into practice, not because of the basic ideas themselves? I mean, democracy has had its problems too, but we don't just give up on it.
That's a good point. And we have to remember that communism is like any idea. It can be twisted and used by people in power to do bad things. People who support communism say that just because some communist governments messed up doesn't mean that the core values are wrong. Things like social justice, economic equality, and workers having more power.
It's like anything. The idea might be good, but it's all about how you do it.
Exactly. And that's the hard part. How do you create a system that's fair and helps everyone without taking away freedom or becoming a dictatorship?
That's a question people have been trying to answer for a long time. And communism.pdf mentions these interesting studies about people who lived under communism. They have mixed feelings about democracy and social welfare.
Yeah, isn't that weird? You'd think that people who live through the bad parts of communism would be all about capitalism and democracy. But a lot of them actually liked things like social safety nets, universal health care, and guaranteed jobs, things that were supposed to be part of communism.
So maybe there are things we can learn from both the good and bad things about communism, even if we don't agree with the whole idea.
Definitely. I think we need to look at the criticisms of both capitalism and communism and really try to understand how economic systems work and how we can make a fairer world. Maybe there are good ideas on both sides.
After this deep dive, I'm starting to think that we shouldn't be so quick to say that communism is irrelevant or dangerous. Maybe there are parts of it that could work in other systems, or maybe we can just learn from what went wrong in the past.
It's all about thinking critically and being open to new ideas, even ideas that make us question what we believe or feel uncomfortable.
That's a great point.
I
And I think that's what we should take away from this whole deep dive. Communism is complicated. It's more than just a label, and we need to understand it better.
It's been great talking about all this with you.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And to everyone listening, I hope this deep dive made you curious and gave you a new way to think about communism. It's something that still affects our world in big ways. So keep your minds open and keep asking questions. Until next time.